chat or in emails, or schedule a follow-up appointment with us as well. Anything that works for you, we're happy to follow up with. But we do want to give you a few pointers along the way, thinking about how we get kids talking to each other and building that sense of community in this new normal we find ourselves in. As we work toward that, our ground rules are the same for those of you who have been with us for a few sessions. For those of you that are new today, and I have seen a few of you that are new today, we begin at on time, so we began at 3 o'clock here. And sorry, I'm admitting a few people here in the background, so I'm splitting my attention. Please stay focused as we ask you to engage in conversations and be respectful when we do. There will be times, as we have throughout our other webinars, where we'll ask you to unmute yourselves and share some ideas. And because of that, please remember that we're all here taking time out of our Tuesday afternoon to be learners and learn more and talk more and discuss more about how we can best support our students. So please assume that we're all coming here with that same positive intent. We'll talk more about the chat feature and on the next slide and outline some different ways we use that for those of you that are first timers with us. And please do mute your microphones when you are not speaking, as I see most of you are already doing. And Anissa will help us stay muted, and that's the reason for that is so we make sure we eliminate some of the background noise that might distract from the main conversation here. So I promised we'd talk more about chats and questions and so on and so forth. And first, please share those in the chat. We appreciate the back channel conversations. Pardon me. They're a powerful learning tool where a lot of ideas get shared as we bring up points in the conversation that bring new ideas for you to mind. So please record that thinking, share that thinking so others can see it. We welcome that in this setting, maybe not so much in a face-to-face professional learning, but here we can see what you're talking about. So when you say, well, I was talking to him about the subject, we know you were actually talking to him about the subject. Questions, as you ask them, will be tracked and responded to. So we do have a few pausing points throughout the session where we'll ask you for some questions or address them as they come up. Where we do have a question and answer session built in at the end. And if we can't answer them in either of those two spots, we will promise a personal follow-up conversation with you. To help us promise that personal follow-up conversation with you, we are saving and recording the chat log here. And that allows us, firstly, to see what questions we might have left unanswered and follow up with you as need be. But also, as you share great ideas, as we bring up things and they spark some thinking for you, allows us to bring those together in nice, nifty bullet points and give you a short recap of not only what we talked about today, but the things that your colleagues in learning have talked about as well. And that is part of the follow-up email we send out. So with that said, and without further ado, let's get our brains going and start thinking a little bit about our warm-up question for the day. So we ask you to reflect on this question and tell us a little bit of information. Which of these common student-to-student structures have you used in your face-to-face instruction? And very quickly, you should get a multiple choice poll showing up on your screen, and please select as many responses that are appropriate to you. Those are think, pair, share, round robin, rally robin, jigsaw, just as a short sampling of things you might use or might have used. You are voting fast and you are voting often. We'll give you just a few more seconds to go ahead and share any last thoughts you have in response to that poll. Okay. And as I share these results with you, you'll see a few things. First, we are pretty familiar with think, pair, share, and that seems to be something that's part of our repertoire. Round robin is pretty familiar to us. Rally robin, though, not so much. And jigsaw is something that a core of us have used at some point in time. So we'll talk some about these structures because the way we've structured today's webinar asks us to compare some of what we've done in some face-to-face instruction as well as to how that might translate or what parts of it can translate to our remote learning and distance learning. So we wanted to get you thinking about some things you've used because in many cases, these practices can still be used in distance learning. It's going to be a little bit of a journey to figure out how we do that, and hopefully we can shed some light on that today. Okay, so let's talk about some of those common elements of high quality student-to-student interactions. And in our estimation, there are 3 key elements, and one of them starts before students even start talking to each other. And that starts with student-to-self time. And we'll talk more about the rationale behind that in a minute. But that is what we see as that key step, that kids need something to bring to the table. And that happens during that student-to-self time where they have time to reflect and think on their own. Then we need to think about that student-to-student interaction. How are they interacting with each other? In what ways? And with what prompts and with what questions and what supports from us as the educator? What does that interaction look like? And finally, the third phase is student-to-class time. That built-in accountability piece that says, you were responsible for thinking about something, yes. You were responsible for talking about something with your peers, yes. And now I want to inspect what I expected you to do to help build that sense of that culture of accountability and responsibility in our classroom. Just in the same way, pardon me, that structure looks, that inspection rather builds that sense of accountability in our face-to-face classrooms. That same sense of accountability can be present and instilled in our distance learning classrooms as well. So we'll talk about some vehicles that we might use to do that. So firstly, we talk about student-to-self time. And as I said, it gives everyone an opportunity to bring something to the table. So it gives you time to privately think or reflect or create a product that represents your best thinking around the prompt. And that prompt that is given to us should be inviting and open-ended. So some key elements of those questions are that we include some tentative language and that we indicate that there's more than one response to this question that I'm asking you. So rather than asking students, what is the solution to the crisis in the Middle East, or what is the plan for finding peace in the Middle East, I can ask them, what are some possible plans? That takes some of the pressure off and thinking about the one best thing, right? And allows them to start thinking about, well, that could work, or that could work, or that could work, and allows them to start bringing some thinking to the table. Where we start vetting that thinking comes a little bit later on in the process as students start comparing ideas with each other, but it's important first to give them an opportunity to bring those thoughts to the table. And that's the purpose of that student-to-self time. So what does that look like? In our traditional face-to-face classrooms, it could look a few ways. It could be think time, where I ask a question and then give you 6, 7, 8, 10 seconds, whatever it might be, to do some private thinking before you start talking to your colleagues or start talking to your students. We could ask them to write first if we wanted to inspect some evidence of that thinking and have some sort of tangible product to refer to. We could ask them to annotate or respond to a reading, or we could ask them to engage in some independent research about a topic or about the prompt that we've given for. And those are all things were I to walk into any or all of your classrooms, those are probably practices that we would see. So what does that look like in distance learning? And that's some of the struggle that we are having that many of the educators we've talked to are having in putting together these interactions is, what's that first step in getting kids talking to each other? So we have in these sessions, as I move down to distance learning, we've talked a little bit about journaling in previous sessions and how that might be helpful on using pen and paper for students who might not have regular access to technology. Or including a journal document in Google Drive or within your learning management system, whatever that happens to be. It could be that there's an initial response to a discussion board question, or whatever the equivalent function is within your learning management system. We know not everyone is built the same way, but if you can post a prompt and have kids respond to it, it serves a similar purpose, and that the student-to-self time could be that initial response. It could be the authoring of an original video or audio clip on either Flipgrid or using the voice recorder on a student's phone to just record some initial thinking. I think this is an answer to that question. Here's one possible way we could reach peace in the Middle East. It could be a response to a formative assessment or check-in question. So it could be as part of our check-ins, we're talking with students and asking them about what they'd like to study next. And getting some one-on-one conversation with them from the teacher and using that information to help group them for the student-to-student phase of the interaction. And it could be, again, that they're independently researching something in that student-to-self time as well. One thing we don't want to leave out is, and we talked about it briefly with journaling, is that for those students, many of us have students who don't have regular access to technology. And in that case, in this one particular instance, probably a lot of those face-to-face strategies are appropriate for them as well. If we have an article for them to read and interact with, or have a prompt for them to think or write about first before they move to that student-to-student step, and we can talk more about what that looks like in a minute, those are certainly some viable alternatives to get them engaged with whatever topic it is that we're posing to them. So I want to stop and pause here, and this is where I will offer the opportunity rather for you to share some of your thinking. What benefits might we see as a result of inspecting student responses to a student-to-self prompt? So in other words, if I've given students an opportunity to write something or draft their own initial video or do some independent research, what benefits might I see as an instructor from asking them to turn that in, and so I can see what they've worked on so far and what they have to bring to the table. Go ahead and drop some thoughts in the chat, and if you feel really brave, feel free to unmute yourself and share your responses verbally as well.
I'll just talk instead of type. I think one of the benefits, especially now since it's distance learning, is you kind of get to see what they're thinking from at home. Like in a classroom, you can kind of read their faces and understand what they might be thinking, but when it comes to distance learning, we're not there with them. So I think it gives them, one, the benefit of them connecting and having purpose in the discussion, and then two, it allows us to kind of guide their thinking in many misconceptions they might have.
Mm-hmm. And that's an important point, right? In the classroom, we can see blank faces or faces that are struggling, our body language that indicates some kind of struggle or the prompt didn't land quite the right way. But here in this context, we can't. So that is certainly one benefit. Nissa, what are you seeing lifted in chat?
Definitely the ideas of gauging their levels of understanding and that a misconception. It is interesting that, when we think at first about that student to self, we're thinking about that immediacy, but we don't always have that. If we have like a synchronous setting, then yes, we do. But if not, then it may be a while before we get that, but it's still that idea of having the kids stop and process for themselves. So I see a lot of getting an understanding of where they are, especially around those misconceptions. And for kids who may not be as comfortable sharing, it gives them that space to think first.
Mm-hmm. And certainly, right, it can serve as a sort of gateway, right, where we might be able to provide some remediation for misconceptions before they move on to that student-to-student stage that we'll talk about next. So for all of you that pointed that out in the chat, and I've been able to peek back and forth and split my attention, that's a great way to look at that. It's another piece of evidence to say who's ready to talk with their peers about this and who has something to bring to the table.
And Randy, one other thing before you move on that popped out to me in the chat, we have had reticent kids all of our teaching lives. And so Lisa mentioned that she has some of her kids that were more quiet in the classroom have actually opened up online. So I know that it's really helpful when we can find those silver linings. And this might be one of them, that some kids are actually flourishing in this type of environment. So how do we take advantage of that and help the other ones who may not be as reticent because they're so oral? It's like, how do we get them to share their thinking in all sorts of different ways?
Well, excellent thought, because that can happen in student-to-student time. And so we'll talk a little bit about that here. So if student-to-self time gives everyone a chance to bring something to the table, student-to-self time is all about sharing what you bring to the table in terms of your own original thinking and testing that against others' thinking and sharing that with them and sort of vetting some better ideas or vetting some ideas that aren't quite as good at either, which I think we've all come to a conversation with a peer and said, I could have done, there's another way to think about that. That might be a little bit better. And that's one of the benefits of student-to-student time is we get to benefit, sharing that mutual learning and that mutual expertise that our peers might have. Generally, though not always, a student-to-student prompt will echo that student-to-self prompt. So in other words, it's share your thinking in response to this prompt, but it might ask students to extend their thinking. So if we ask them to first think about what are some possible solutions to the crisis in the Middle East, we might extend their thinking by asking, which of your two solutions do you like best and why? So one more wrinkle, right? One more little nudge on there to really vet that thinking and think about that. They both brought something to the table as a result of their student-to-self time. Now they have a chance to share and compare those ideas in the student-to-student time. So in our classrooms, and these are the structures we talked about earlier, when we talk about think, pair, share, many of you said that is something that's a regular part of your repertoire. The pairing part, where students are talking to each other, is a great example of this student-to-student time. For those of you that said Jigsaw, when you have your expert groups meeting and they're saying, here's what I got from this article or this excerpt, and they're sharing, that's another excellent example of student-to-student time. In round-robin conversations where I have a group of 3 or 4 and students are going around the table sharing what they got from that, that's another example of that. And in Rally Robin, which I think we had a 0% on the poll, when students are sharing ideas back and forth. So if I have a pair of students going, student A shares and student B shares and A and B shares, and they're kind of rapid fire exchange, that's another opportunity to share some of that. And certainly we can talk more about that strategy if you're interested, but not the main focus of where we're at today. So we need to think about what the student-to-student interactions look like inside this distance learning framework that we're in. So if I've posted a discussion board in my prompt, I can ask students to respond to those discussion board prompts. So if I have initial response, Anissa might come by a few days later and say, Randy, that was a good idea because, or have you thought about this? Or make some of that, or use some other sentence starters to really push my thinking as an initial responder. For students that are lower tech, or don't have regular access to the internet, we might invite them to participate in conference or three-way calls as our own technology and infrastructure permits, rather. So I might have, while I know many of you are engaging in check-in calls, we might have, those check-in calls can often be individual, but we might have 2 or 3 students on the same call in this case to give them an opportunity to have that small group conversation around one of these key ideas we're talking about. We might ask them to author a response to a peer video or audio clip. So if we're using apps like Flipgrid or Voice Recorder, let's go ahead and ask them to respond to their peers or record another clip saying whether they disagree or agree with their students and why. As we move down to the bottom 3 options, where we look more at, rather than just responding, we look at collaborating to make a product. So they could collaborate to write some kind of research report or research paper. That would work together, where if they've both done some independent research, they can bring their best thinking together to make that report. If we want to give them a more authentic audience to look at or to publish for, we might ask them to use Google Sites, if we're a Google school, to create a joint web page that shares more about what they found out, or use things like PBWorks to make a wiki for our class to store some of this information. We might also ask them to collaborate on a podcast. We know that at least many of us are probably knee-deep in podcasts, and we're listening to them on our commutes to work. Students may need some more exposure to them, but it's certainly another media that's taken off in recent years that we can connect them with. So all of those are possible options. All of those collaborative media ventures are something we can ask our students to engage in. But the question is, so how do we do that? What does that actually look like? And in our estimation, there are 4 things we need to pay attention to as we're structuring some of this student-to-student talk. The first is we need to establish some ground rules or norms for that interaction. So just as we do in our classrooms, when we ask students to talk to each other, we need to help them establish some ground rules and some expectations of what are acceptable ways and manage to communicate and what are not. So this is by no means an exhaustive list, and we're happy to send out more later. But we might ask them to, have run ground rule B, explain your reasoning, and then invite questions. And that gives everybody the opportunity to say, here's what I think and why, and then let people asking questions. Sometimes when students start with the questions, right, that question can be received the wrong way, and it can be off-putting and actually destroy the value of that interaction. So when we have an opportunity to explain ourselves first, that might be a helpful ground rule. The last two are more about how we treat each other, especially when we are talking about a collaborative effort. We disagree, but respectfully, or we separate people from the problem, and we make sure we're disagreeing with their ideas, not with the people. Again, attending to that social emotional need of how do I work within, or social emotional learning rather, of how do I work within groups, small or large, and what are some acceptable ways to communicate in that setting. So for that reason, student-to-student interactions are another great asset in our tool belts because they can attend to some of those SEL aspects as well. Within those interactions, we want to be mindful of giving examples and criteria that says what good work looks like. So if it's a discussion board prompt, we might want to give some guidelines on length. In some case, depending on your grade level, a 250 word mark, 500 word mark are appropriate lengths for those discussion boards. In other settings, if it's a collaborative report or a wiki article, we might want to set a minimum length on that to help guide students about how much it is enough. We might also want to prepare a rubric to help communicate expectations to students if it is a large enough interaction to warrant that. If we're simply having a short exchange within our synchronous meetings here in a Zoom call or whatever the case might be, just talking to each other informally doesn't necessarily need a rubric. But for an extended report or for a wiki page or some kind of media creation, that's where we might want to get more explicit about the quality and accuracy of facts and so on and so forth, and really mentioning those things. Also important is, especially when we're asking students to respond to each other. So we're thinking again, like some of the video or voice recording clips or discussion boards, providing some sentence stems, like I wonder, or wish in a star, or some kind of structure like that for them to provide some feedback to each other can be helpful in order to make sure that those relationships and that feedback is heard the right way. We want to make sure that we are stating and keeping specific timeframes. So in a discussion board, we might want to say that everyone needs to have your first response done by Tuesday, and everybody needs to have their additional follow-up responses done by Friday of this week, so we can keep the conversation going. We might set expectations about kind of midweek expectations about when different parts of a collaborative report might be. Your introduction is due on X date, your body paragraphs are due on Y date, and so on and so forth. And also we want to keep an eye toward the entire interaction, how long that should take. Again, shorter interactions, video clips probably have shorter time frames. If we're a collaborative report, that might be a week or 2 or 3, depending on the size of that report. We also want to talk a bit about the roles and responsibilities of group members in media production. So again, thinking about those last 3 options of the collaborative report, wiki pages, podcasts, and so on and so forth. Are there students that we know that are better researchers and are able to navigate the web better to find information? Are there students we know that are better pulling information together to edit that or produce visuals? The answer is probably yes. Pardon me. And it's okay that they differentiate that because they all did that initial research to bring to the table. They also all have the opportunity within that project to interact with the information, present it in different ways that make sense to them. So dividing roles in that way can make sense for when we're talking about them producing some sort of media in this remote setting. So we want to pause here and ask you to reflect a little bit about what we've talked about here in the previous 2 slides. In what ways does structuring student-to-student interaction support students of a variety of skill levels? So if I have the student-to-student interaction, I've planned for students to collaborate on a discussion board, for example. How does that help kids at the lower end, at the higher end, and in the middle, or in any other of these structures? Please feel free to drop some thoughts in the chat or unmute yourselves and share some thoughts. And Nissa, what are some things you're seeing pop up in chat?
Well, Randy, some of the things that we're seeing, especially when it comes to like a variety of skills, is that everybody can access that because everybody can think about a response to a prompt, whether it's, you know, a right, a more right or less right answer. When our prompts are more open-ended, that gives kids a better opportunity to have something to think about. Also seeing the fact that structuring really can promote social skills, which are helpful not only for the variety of cognitive skills that our kids bring to the table, but for our SEL as well. And then there's a few people who were talking about the how it validates kids' thinking, not just from the adult, but from other students as well. And then right now, because it's not necessarily right at the same time, they can choose how, you know, when to give that input and how much input.
Say more a little bit about that last point about choosing when to give input and how much, only because I don't have the chat displayed. What was some of the conversation around that point?
Well, let me read it. Okay. Everyone can choose how much input they want to give. It gives them more control. So I might have misspoken about the when, because I was like reading two at the same time. But that how much input I think is important because some of our kids that may struggle with putting thought to paper, even in a discussion board type of setting, may have an easier time. And let me see. Yeah, and then the rest, there's a lot of things about the perspectives as well and that support of each other. So the support not just from us, but from each other as well.
And I think that
and there's a question on the table, Randy, that I don't know if you can answer immediately, but Trevor, we're gonna find an answer. And if anybody has a great idea, then let us know. Is there any easy way to keep track of who has submitted their discussion boards? Like obviously we can go down the discussion board, but are there any tricks that people have found in terms of how to track to make sure that everybody is participating?
There are a few things that I can think of right off the top of my head, but please feel free to pour ideas in chat as well. Depending on who is running your discussion board, by who I mean what learning management system your school uses. So Schoology and Blackboard allow you to highlight specific users, and you could go to click on student X and see their initial response, and then click the next button and hit their any replies they've made or so on and so forth. And so that is a viable way to do that. If you are in a situation where you don't have that functionality, so it's just people responding to an open question you posted, say in a Google Classroom or whatever, and not necessarily inside a structured discussion, a workaround around that might be to hit Control F to help you search the web page, and that should bring up a little search box. You could type in a student's name and see how many results you get for that student's name within that discussion, just to give you a quick insight into how many times or when they participated or not. It's not the I guess it's not the most automatic solution. It does still require some effort, but it does save some of that manual scrolling of oh, did I get that student yet? Oh, did I check that yet? Oh, did I get that? It's one way around it. It's clumsy, but depending on the functionality you have available to you, it may be the best option available to you.
And Randy, just to add on to that, I was talking to an ELL teacher yesterday, and one of the things that she took from the old way, from her classroom into this new online setting is she used to have a clipboard that had, you know, all of the kids' names. And so whenever she would conference with kids, because she's ELL, so really working with their language skills, she would make a little note naturally as she would go by and talk with the kids or have them come up to her desk. So now it's something very similar where she's doing that in order to keep track of who's doing that discussion board. So as she's looking and reading through, she can just very quickly make a jot. I don't know if that's any better. It works for her at the moment, And that's what she's discovered because it's something she was familiar with and comfortable with that she's like modified for this, for the discussion board.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a crucial point to bring up, is that a lot of our practices and a lot of our documentation that we used in the before times still have some weight and some value here, right? It's a matter of finding the specific ways and the specific niches in which they might apply. The clipboard to track student interaction is probably a tool that many of you have in your back pocket, but it's a tool that transfers here as well to the discussion board. So that's a neat idea to share, and something that we can all be reminded of, is that a lot of the things we have done and do well still work here too. They still work now. The third element to a successful student to student interaction is student to class time. And the purpose is to hold students, to groups accountable for bringing something to the table. So if I have a pair of students talking to each other, I'm now having that same pair of students share out to the whole class. But we also want to hold others accountable for hearing what their classmates share. So while I'm sharing, I want to have a captive audience, and I want that audience to interact with me and get something from my presentation. So that's the purpose of the student to class time. It generates some accountability. It generates that sense of, oh, well, Miss Dooley really cares about what I'm doing here, right? Because I'm going to be put on the spot to present whatever it is I just thought about, whether that is a small conversation I had in the space of a minute or an extended research paper we had the chance to collaborate on over a week. There's still some kind of public performance. There's that expectation set upon me. We do want to be careful to point out, though, in that second box, that we shared some of that thinking either in some or in part. So there are lots of good reasons why we should not have students or pairs of students read their entire research papers to their friends, right? And have that happen like 30 times over, or read their paper to their classmates and have that happen 30 times over in a row, because that might bore everyone to tears, right? But if we were to ask them to give a small, oral summary of that and the abstract of their research paper, if you will, that's a little more bite-sized, a little more manageable for people to interact with. So that's something to be mindful of as well. When we engage in the student to class time, it doesn't have to be share everything you worked on. It can be share a summary of what you worked on or share the highlights of what you worked on as well. So in face-to-face settings, in the before times, what did this look like? It looked like us calling on random members of groups to share. So after think, pair, share, the sharing part might be, hey, group A, I need one of you to share. Group B, give me one of you to share. Group C, give me one of you to share. And we get a random thinking and sampling that way, or random sample of thinking that way. It also might look like gallery walks where each group had posted their poster around the room and everyone had a chance to walk around and circulate and provide some comments and feedback and really see what everyone else was thinking. It can also look like presentations, whether that's presentations to the large group or presentations to a small group, where I have one student presenting to a pair of students presenting to 3 other pairs of students. So no one has to sit through 30 presentations, but we all have that experience of the public speaking to hold ourselves accountable for the work that we've done. In the distance learning setting, you can see that there's a lot of parallels that can exist. The gallery walk can still happen. If we are publishing assignments in our LMS and making them public so other students can view them, so other students can go and give comments on research papers or things like that and say, I wonder, or went well and this is an area for growth. That's still an option here in this setting. We might also use Padlet as kind of an open whiteboard for students to really record some of those artifacts or record links to some of those artifacts they've made. So here's a link to the video that we made, or here's a link to the paper and the video and the article that we made. So all of our thinking is in one place. That's an option as well. And students can still circulate around and provide comments inside the space of those apps. Presentations can still be a tool in our tool belt. In synchronous settings, they could happen in either a large group or small group, a Zoom call, a Meet call, or a Teams call. And I want to stress that that might not mean that all 30 of your kids are on the call at once. It might be a group, 3 different pairs or 3 small groups you have on that synchronous call as well. Asynchronously, certainly students could upload videos to YouTube or take advantage of apps like Flipgrid or Animoto to record small videos or to edit small videos and excerpts and bring those together, pardon me, for sharing and thinking. For students who don't have regular access to technology, we could think again about conference calls, but looping a few other groups in as well. So if in the student-to-student time, we had a pair or 3 students on that conference call, in this setting, we might have 5, 6, 7 kids dial in to hear some thinking of their peers. It's not a perfect solution, but it does still give them that opportunity to present publicly and have that public accountability for their work. And in many cases, especially in the case of a discussion board, some of their thinking is already made visible, right? Where discussion board, everybody can see what you're thinking, everybody can see what you're typing, your thinking is already out there, so that public accountability is already there. I, as a student, can see that my peers have responded to either me or to other prompts, and I can see that my instructor has been active in this discussion as well. It's not as though we just posted a question and let students talk about it. We might jump in and moderate and, again, add to that sense of community and accountability by being active participants in that conversation. So all of those are options for that student to class time to really build in that accountability space. The other aspect of accountability we need to think about is, what does the audience do? So if I'm listening or viewing or doing something with this presentation, if I'm a member in the audience, there has to be an expectation for me too, right? Otherwise, I'm going to check out. And if I hear that there's going to be 3 straight days of presentations, I might not turn my brain on for 3 straight days of presentations. So as the educator, we might ask them to engage in some structured note-taking in a graphic organizer or some other format to say, for them to record their takeaways. We might ask them to do some summative or reflective writing either after each presentation or after a group of presentations. I used to think, but now I know, is a great way to ask them to interact with that, as well as any other reflective prompt you might ask them for in their journals, or it is an exit ticket, whatever the case might be. In distance learning, that's going to look pretty similar, we think. We might have some structured note-taking, so if students are viewing a variety of videos produced by their peers, they might have a graphic organizer that they're printing and jotting some notes on, saying, I got this or I got that from this presentation. It could be that they are submitting that graphic organizer online as well as part of their learning management system. It could be a summative or reflective writing much the same way. I've viewed 3 presentations and here's what I think about them. I used to think, or here's what I learned from them. It might also be that their final accountability piece is recording a video or audio response to what they've seen in general to really carry that conversation forward. Any of those are possible options, and any of those media work for that individual accountability. The gist, though, is that we want to make sure that students who are in the audience, who are not actively presenting, are still expected to be involved in the conversation. And these are some vehicles we might use for that. So our one more stop and jot is focused on this prompt. What implicit messages might we send to students when we plan and communicate expectations for accountability during presentations? So not explicitly, right? We're not saying these things verbally. We're not writing this message on the board. What does it say implicitly to students when we establish those sorts of expectations? Please feel free to drop some thoughts into chat or to unmute yourselves and share some thinking. And Nissa, what is some of the thinking you're seeing shared in the chat?
The idea of the importance of what others say, the validation of their peers, and that's really the resounding message so far. Because if we think about the SEL aspect, it's not just about content. When we're talking about student-to-student interactions, the more we can get kids interacting with each other, the more it also helps support the SEL, because they're feeling just as isolated, if not more so than we are.
That's an important point, right? That we can certainly get them engaged in content here, right? But in many cases, our students are craving that student-to-student interaction as well. They are likely texting, they're doing whatever they can do to interact with each other at this time if they're able to. But certainly providing a formal structure and still keeping them in mind and teaching them how to interact in these more academic and professional settings is a valuable skill as well. So certainly as we think about structuring these interactions where they're working with each other, that is another value added piece that we can consider.
Right. And Randy, something that's come up several times, just, throughout all of this, especially if we were talking about the student to student and the student to class, is thinking about, okay, so how do we roll in our low tech kids? And so it could be if they don't necessarily have the capability of creating a video, but yet they can watch one, then maybe they're doing a little bit more on the responding piece, but not so much on the presenting piece. Or they're not presenting in the same way. So I think anything that we can do to try to, whether that's like Padlet, somebody was asking about Padlet and whether all of the kids could see each other's responses. Anytime where you have that, something that I know that Randy and I have talked with a couple teachers about is screenshotting that or printing that out and putting it in the weekly packet and asking the kids to respond to so many of their classmates and what their classmates said. It's not ideal, again, but it at least helps to try to loop them in and make them feel like they're still part of the class, especially when we've got a few kids that are low tech and everybody else is on Google Classroom.
Mm-hmm. And that's an important consideration as well as we think about Maslow's hierarchy, right? Midway in that middle of that pyramid is that sense of belonging. And for students who are low tech that might feel a little alienated / isolated at this point, where we can still get them involved in the best proxies that we can with their peers, that's always will be welcome for them, or will be welcomed by them. That said, one other point Anissa brought up is as you have questions about apps and things like that, my formal education and training is in educational technology, which means I look at apps all day in addition to my work here. So if you are feeling the need to explore or you want to think more about what a certain app might do for you or figure out if it would work for you at all, please feel free to use the calendar links or the Calendly links that we send in the follow-up emails to schedule some time with either of us at no cost or obligation to you, right? It's just another opportunity to figure out what's working for you or what might not work for you and help you make it work for your kids. So if we were to bring this all back together, we think there are 4 steps to executing student-to-student interaction. First, we want to make sure we pose that question, problem, or prompt to the class. So we might initially publish that at the opening of the assignment or at the opening of the peer conversation or the think, pair, share in our face-to-face settings. Then it's important for us to communicate the structure in which the interaction will take place. So you will talk first, you will talk second, you will be the researcher, you will be the editor, so on and so forth. And you have this long to present or this long to work on it. Indicating that structure up front is helpful because it lets students know exactly what it is that they're meant to accomplish over the next set period of time. As they go forward, monitor those interactions, so we can't just set them to work loose on a discussion board or set them loose on a collaborative effort or collaborative paper without checking in on them from time to time. We know that in the classroom it helps when we walk around and to keep kids on track and on task. certainly walking around, and I'm using air quotes, but popping in on student work that they've shared with you and seeing whether or not they're on the right track can be helpful as well. So please do be mindful of that in the between times. And certainly inspect multiple responses. So, of course, in where we ask them to make a collaborative media venture, we're going to be checking everybody's work when they turn that in. But in the case of smaller instances where we ask them to do a think, pair, share, or a short video flip-good response, make sure we make it known that we're looking at a few different people's responses, that we're calling on people and sharing some of that thinking with the class, so that they know that Mr. Gale is looking at me, right, and that I might be called on next, and he might want to look at what I have to say. So all those things might be important. We want to make sure that they know and we're looking at what they're doing. So we want to finish where we started and remind us that there's 3 key elements to student-to-student interactions, and that one of them happens before kids even start talking to each other, and that's student-to-self time. They have an opportunity to think about something on their own and to get ready to bring something to the table. The student-to-student time is where they work together and share what they brought to that table. And the student-to-class time is where they share the results or the fruits of that labor that they had in their small group or their partnership. So we want you to think about one final stop and jot here before we get ready to say bid you farewell. In what ways could planning to incorporate these elements impact student engagement in the work? So please feel free to jot some thinking in the chat or to unmute yourself and add some thinking here. And Anissa, what are some things that you're seeing trickle in here?
All right, had to unmute myself.
I got worried. Okay.
Some of the comments are around things like the teaching becoming more intentional towards the expected outcomes, because the kids see the direct link between what they're doing and why, that deliberate and intentional piece, and letting the kids know that their responses count. That's come up a couple of times, and especially not only that the SEL of the kids sharing, but the recognition piece that you had mentioned and that a couple people had mentioned in the chat as well.
All right. All of those are great thoughts. I see the chat windows continue to fill up here as well. Some other things about student focus and student participation and effort, and all of those things are true, right? When students know that there's that public, there's an expectation of some kind of public performance, they're more likely to bring something to the table. And that, I think, whether we're in face-to-face or a remote context, is an important reminder for us as educators in building that sense of accountability and building that culture within our rooms.
And I think, Randy, the other thing that is so difficult to answer is like it's a horse and cart, right? Do we try to put the best, well, which the answer is yes, but do we put the best engaging activities together in the hopes of trying to hook more kids? Or do we have to have the kids first in order to have that engagement? And I think that it works both ways. It's trying to get that mass of kids, especially with our secondary. What some of the folks that we've talked to have said is the more that they've tried to structure it like regular school, like to feel comfortable, the more kids are talking to each other outside of class time and saying, you know what, it's not so bad. You need to come the next time, like to a synchronous session, or you need to put something in the discussion board. So it's getting kids involved because they're seeing, oh, okay, this isn't so bad. It isn't just filling out this worksheet. It's about actually still talking to my friends.
Mm-hmm. Okay. As we get ready to wind down, and don't leave just yet, we do want to open up the floor for any general question and answers that people might have. So please feel free to drop them in chat or to unmute yourselves and ask questions about the presentation or any parts of it. And then after we've had some Q&A time and address what we can in the next few minutes here, we will share our exit survey with you and all that sort of stuff. So one question we see from Autumn is that does WebEx have breakout capabilities like Zoom does? The answer is yes, but that is a paid feature just as it is in Zoom. So depending on your school's licensing and what they're willing to shell out for here at the moment, for lack of a more appropriate term, you may or may not have that feature available to you. But I do know that WebEx does have that feature. And at any rate, if you have more questions about specific apps, again, as I mentioned earlier, please feel free to reach out to either of us. I saw briefly a mention of Seesaw and perhaps getting together to talk to a few folks. And I'm certainly happy to, if there are a few elementary folks that want to take a tour through Seesaw or talk more about how it might be used, I'm happy to do that as well. And we can work out the logistics of that a little bit later on. But please, like I said, feel free to reach out. That's part of what we're here for. We're here to think with you, not just inside this hour, but through all of this journey as we go forward. Shortly, either now or in a few minutes from now, in your inbox, you will have a email on the email message at the address you registered for this webinar with. So for some of you, it may be as your personal email address. That feedback survey allows you to tell us a little bit more about how we're doing and what topics you might like to see in future sessions. For those of you that require some piece of paper that says, yep, the teacher Z participated in this amount of hours of PL, we use those survey responses to track who attended. So if you're in need of a printed certificate in June, please make sure you're taking that survey. That's the best evidence we have of your attendance and participation here. Those surveys do ask for an exit ticket, and today's exit ticket is as follows. Describe a student-to-student interaction that would support student learning of an upcoming ICANN statement. So if you are taking a look forward to the next week or two, and you are thinking about an ICANN statement and how you might get kids involved and start building that accountability, that critical mass of kids to get engaged or re-engaged in school, tell us a little about what you're thinking, and we're happy to follow up with you as we might need to, or you indicate you might want us to help flesh out those ideas. With that said, that's all for me. So I will turn it over to Anissa for any parting words she has. It's been a little slice of heaven spending the afternoon with you, and I look forward to seeing you all again soon.
All right, that's all I got, guys. So I just want to reiterate what Randy said. Please feel free to reach out via email and just let us know if you want to sit down and talk and go through any apps or go through any thinking and get feedback on as you're figuring all this out. We're all figuring it out together. Thank you guys so much. Look for the email. I'm hitting send right now. And we really appreciate the feedback and appreciate you guys being here. So hope to see you in another one. Thanks. Have a great Tuesday afternoon.
For those of you who may want to stick around and have individual question or a group question, we will stay on the call for a few minutes. But you are by no means obligated to stay any longer than you are right now.
Deborah, did we answer your question sufficiently earlier about the iReady? Okay.
Thank you.
No problem.
Amy, I saw the question about Seesaw. I don't have a presentation ready to go in my belt at the moment for it. We can talk briefly about it, or we can set up a time a little bit later this week for us to talk about that in some more detail.
Well, my question really is, our school uses Google Classroom. We use Google Meets to meet with our students, but the question that we keep getting over and over again is from our parents, how do we know what our kids have completed or not completed? And so I guess when I saw the mention of Seesaw, I kind of pulled it up real quick on my phone, and it looks like it's some type of platform where parents can see what the kids are doing. Is that, I can research it more on my own, but I was hoping maybe just a quick little synopsis or brief little, you know, hey, this is what it is. It would be great because I've never heard of it before.
Okay. So like I said, I don't have anything in the pocket ready to go, so you're going to get off the cuff answer, so to speak.
Thank you.
So it is. So first, the one thing I would think about with Google Classroom before we talk about Seesaw is I'm reasonably confident that they do have a feature where you can invite parents in to see some of that student work as well. So that might be one solution. But I also know that in general, Google Classroom is not friendly for like the K-3 audience. There's a lot of stuff going on there as far as little kids and what they're able to do. So Seesaw essentially, as you're thinking about it, would take the place of Google Classroom. It's very much a learning management system in that way. But the user interface in terms of what kids see and what they're able to interact with is a little more simpler. It flows a little better. It's not built for high school kids the same way Google Classroom is, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So it's a little more user friendly in that sense for them. It has some more functions for teachers that are helpful, like being able to provide voice feedback directly on student work, or being able to write directly on student work, and where Google doesn't quite have some of those things. So that can be helpful as well, especially when the little folks want to hear from you, or they want to see your video, see your face rather, because we know that's probably more important to them than it is to a senior.
It is.
So it's definitely something to take a look at. And if you want to think more about it, we can certainly book a time to go into a little more detail. But I hope that answers your question for now.
It does. Thank you for taking a minute to kind of expand on that a little bit. Definitely something I'll probably talk to our technology team about for our littler kids.
Amy,
yes.
you and I can get together maybe and talk about it together.
Okay, sounds good. All right. Thank you guys very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lean, you can call me.
Got it, Amy.
Bye.
Bye.